afternoon. As folks are joining, welcome. Welcome to our webinar. Very excited to have you all here. I want to go over some quick logistics while people continue to join this webinar. So the first, we have a Q&A feature that is a much easier way for us to find questions. If you submit questions in the chat, we're likely to lose them. We love your questions. We will have a Q&A period, but please do submit those through the Q&A feature, not the chat, so we don't lose them. This is being recorded, so the recording will be emailed to registrants, and the presentation slides will also be sent out to registrants. It'll also be posted on the CGS website as a member benefits, so this is a member-only webinar. And then finally, please don't submit questions to the chat for the panelists, but you're more than welcome to use the chat to discuss with other CGS members, share insights, resources. Please do use the chat, just not for those Q&A questions, so that we can make sure to answer them appropriately. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Julia Kent to introduce the webinar, our speakers, and the topic.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Julia Kent. I'm Vice President for Best Practices and Strategic Initiatives at CGS. We're so pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, which is called Building a Healthy Research Culture, Where to Start. I'm sure this is a topic that many of you have given a lot of thought to. And as many of you know from attending CGS meetings, this is a topic that CGS has given a lot of thought to, particularly because culture change has a reputation for being very hard. It's hard to figure out who should be accountable for change. It's difficult to figure out how to give incentives and to also provide guidance that is clear, expectations that are clear to both students and faculty. And so we're really thrilled to welcome two presenters from a CGS member institution, the University of Toronto, who have done a lot of work on this topic with a focus on research team environments. So today I'm going to welcome Dr. Joshua Barker, who is Dean of the School of Graduate Studies and Vice Provost Graduate Education and Research at the University of Toronto, and his colleague, Dr. Lynn Osher, who is Associate Director, Center for Graduate Professional Development of the School of Graduate Studies, also at the University of Toronto. I'd also like to give a little plug for a session that they will be organizing and that Dr. Barker will be leading at our upcoming annual meeting. You'll get a little bit more information about that at the end of the presentation. It's on Wednesday, December 6th as a pre-meeting workshop. So this is a workshop that you'll need to sign up for in addition to the annual meeting. I believe Sarah will be putting some information about registration in the chat. And you can learn more about their project and how you might implement a version of it on your own campus at that session. So thank you again, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Joshua Barker.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia, for the introduction. And I also want to thank CGS President Suzanne Ortega for the invitation to present today. It's an honor, and it's just also a pleasure to have the opportunity to share some of our learnings with colleagues at other institutions. I'd like to just begin with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Next slide, please. So let me just give you a little bit of a sense of the structure of today's session, which, as Julia mentioned, focuses on building a healthy research culture, and really focusing on the first stages of that and the experiences that we've had and the learnings we've had going along the way. So I'm going to begin by introducing a little bit of context about the University of Toronto, some of which you see here on this slide. Then I'm going to describe the impetus for the Healthy Research Cultures Initiative here, where it came from, how we arrived at the plan that we have for a program in this area, and what were some of the learnings and challenges we've encountered along the way. Then I'm going to hand it over to Lynn, and she's going to describe some of the core elements of the program and how it's organized. And then we'll have opportunities for some Q&A. So the first thing to understand about U of T is it's a fairly large institution. We have 3 campuses, 7 colleges, and 17 academic divisions. Now, those academic divisions are what in many US schools would be called colleges. Our 3 campuses, we have 1 central one, which is the oldest, and we have 2 newer ones, which are somewhat smaller, located in the east and west regions of this large metropolis here of Toronto. I just wanted to highlight a couple things here. First of all, number of graduate students we have is 21,000 plus, and about half of those are in research programs, either in master's or PhD programs. And then we have, of course, 15,000 faculty and roughly 1,500 postdoctoral fellows. And so these are the primary communities that are touched by the initiative we're describing today. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about kind of the composition of our student body and where they're located. So we have overall about close to 100,000 students at the university. As I mentioned, around 1/5 of those are graduate students. And you'll notice that roughly 30% of our graduate students are international. But even of the domestic ones, this is a large multicultural city. And so the domestic students are also very diverse, and many of them may have been born elsewhere in the world before coming to Toronto and becoming citizens or permanent residents here. And then the concentration of graduate research activity still remains on our downtown campus. But increasingly, we are seeing our suburban campuses, the University of Toronto Mississauga, University of Toronto Scarborough, as new sites for a lot of research activities. We've got a growing number of labs in those locations. And so they are also very important constituents for this program. Next slide, please. So let me then just talk a little bit about what some of the reasons are that we wanted to create this initiative. I would say, you can kind of step back and look at the larger changes that the research system, as well as the graduate education ecosystem, has been undergoing. And I think particularly about sort of some of the big pre-pandemic moments that we had in terms of the Me Too movement, the anti-racism movements, most of which centered in the US, but had a huge impact on us here in Canada as well as just an overall shift in the discourse and expectations around research culture. And on the graduate education landscape side, I think what we experienced most prior to the pandemic, and then it was only amplified by the pandemic, was really a growing concern about graduate student mental health and wellness, as well as career sustainability concerns, particularly for the PhD programs, and really thinking about what the outcomes of those programs are, and whether we're, the culture of research and whether our programs are setting students up for success in a range of careers, not just sort of tenure track jobs, as may have traditionally been the case. So those are some of the broad sphere, I think, context for why we began to think of this program. But there were also some very specific, institutionally specific reports that came out, roughly around 5 years ago, which really zeroed in on some of the challenges specifically that we were seeing at the senior levels in basic science laboratories or laboratories. And so we've provided here a quote from one of the annual reports that came out of our ombudsperson's office, which was that the School of Graduate Studies should consider developing and implementing a strategy which identifies, celebrates, and effectively communicates the characteristics of optimum learning environments for students in basic science labs. So what's important to kind of recognize there is that the Ombuds Office really is the final office that trainees, students will end up at if they feel that their concerns at the university have not been adequately concerned and heard and addressed. And so this recommendation reflects what the ombudsperson at the time felt was a growing number of cases that actually centered around issues in labs, but was also pointing us in a direction which was not punitive in nature. It was about trying to shift the culture at the institution, and therefore looking for a longer term type of solution. And that's kind of what is going to be a going theme throughout this program and also this presentation. It wasn't just an issue that was being noticed in the Ombuds Office. Obviously, in SGS, we were noticing it as well, but also the Office of the Vice President, Research and Innovation had noted that there were quite a number of issues taking place that were leading to conflicts in lab environments, including the lack of clear expectations, poor communication, lack of understanding around authorship practices, and fractured student-supervisor relationships. Next slide, please. So what we chose to do then was to join up with the Office of the Vice President, Research and Innovation. So it was really started out as a joint project between the VPRI and the School of Graduate Studies here. And we commissioned a report by a highly respected lab scientist by the name of Professor Reinhard Reitmeier, as well as a then PhD student, Sarah Williams. And they went out and did a lot of consultation and discussion and reading and learning. And they produced a report that came up with about 20 recommendations, which included things like the implementation of more training and the creation of an internal reward system. That was a key report for us that came out just before the pandemic, but it also dovetailed with a separate process at the university, which had been a presidential and provostial task force on student mental health, which also addressed graduate student mental health, which had a recommendation for the university to get away from its kind of solitary focus on research excellence and to really think about promoting a culture of caring as well as excellence for graduate students. And so the combination of what had been a more top-down type of process and the bottom-up process that we were initiating created a certain momentum for the initiative that we're describing today. Next slide, please. So just to understand where we see this initiative fitting in to the broader landscape and where we see, as we kind of looked more closely, we found there was a bit of a gap, frankly, in how we were engaging with our research community and with our graduate community, is to think about it in terms of sitting between a focus on supervisory relationships which we have focused on for some time. And in the recent years, we've also created a center specifically focused on the graduate mentorship and supervision, which really focuses on the dyadic relationship between supervisors and students, but has a lot of relevance to research team environments as well. So we have been focusing on the supervisory relationship. At the same time, through our standard quality assurance processes, we have a way of addressing programmatic issues because we do regular, external reviews of our graduate programs, and there's a constant kind of formative feedback we're getting from those reviews, which can help address some of the culture issues that might exist in departments. But where we were missing something was at that kind of intermediate level, which we've sometimes thought of in terms of research teams, research groups, where we were seeing certain kinds of dynamics that can appear in that environment. And some of them can be incredibly positive, and then others not so much so. And so it was really, the program was really developed to try to really figure out what the optimum environments are for research taking place at that intermediate level, and for the kinds of social relationships that are proper to that level. And at the same time, we had our eye on broader national level conversations. In Canada, we have three main government funding agencies: the National Science and Engineering Research Council, we have the Health Council, and we have the Social Sciences and Humanities Council. And they were also looking more proactively at trying to foster healthy research environments. And a key element of that is in the area of equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, or what in the US is often called DEI. Next slide, please. So our overall goal for this program was to create a culture of continual learning and celebration of healthy research practices in the same way that we celebrate research and teaching accomplishments by faculty. And I really see this initiative as being analogous to earlier changes that this particular institution underwent, which was kind of introducing a much greater focus on our quality of teaching. We had always prided ourselves on our excellence in research, and it was mainly along those lines that our faculty were rewarded for their work, and the merit system was pretty much built around that. But we went through an era, really starting a couple of decades ago, where the institution started to place a lot more attention on teaching, and by that it was mainly classroom teaching. And we developed a Center for Teaching Support and Innovation, which helped to drive a lot of that new focus and provide training associated with it, and so on. And so in my mind, that was kind of an example of how you can set a priority centrally, and then through some key initiatives, some training opportunities, you can over time, and we really are talking not about year to year, but we're talking more about in a decade or a couple of decades, you can gradually shift the culture to focus on areas that perhaps had been somewhat overlooked in the past. Next slide, please. So as I said, the project overall was a collaboration between SGS and our Vice President Research and Innovations Office. And we've always, you'll see in a minute, it's been widely consultative, but I also just wanted to identify some of the people who have played very key roles in this along the way. Next slide. So, you know, developing an initiative of this kind is, you know, not so easy. And it really does depend on a lot of stakeholder feedback. And that feedback is really aimed at trying to find the places of alignment between, you know, how people, researchers, you know, supervisors, lab leaders, students, others, how they're experiencing their day-to-day lives and the efforts they're making in their labs, in their research teams, and so on, and finding ways to align those with the broader objectives that I've outlined above. And so, one of the things that's taken some time about developing this program has been a whole bunch of consultation and discussion, and some of that has taken the form of us kind of going around and presenting about our ideas for the program to a lot of different constituent groups, whether that's student groups, groups of students, or others involved, you know, who have some expertise in the mental health space, EDI space, graduate administrators, chairs, and so on. And then part of it was pulling together, you know, more specific disciplinary groups in the form of focus groups, some of our most distinguished faculty, the university professors, and award winners of our supervision awards, and getting much more specific feedback coming from really our thought leaders in these areas. And then also, since, as I'm sure is it true at every institution, there's always a lot of educational programming underway, much of which is provided centrally in various offices. We needed to make sure that where we were inserting ourselves into that ecosystem of training and learning would be, you know, filling gaps where necessary, creating collaborative relationships where necessary. And so we specifically created a committee that had representatives from some of our key central offices who operate in these various domains that you can see in the right-hand column. And so we're not looking at necessarily producing all of our programming ourselves, but also collaborating and cross-branding programming that others are already providing in one way, in one form or another. Next slide. So just to kind of give you a little bit more texture to what came out of all those different kind of consultation processes, and just sort of boil it down to what we encountered in this environment as being key learning and decision points. Probably the biggest one was just the distinction between taking a carrot approach versus a stick approach. You know, is the initiative going to be about solving problems and addressing bad actors? Or is it going to be about highlighting good practices in areas for potential growth? And here, as I had indicated, you know, we really endorsed the idea of an upstream, proactive, celebratory program, taking the carrot approach versus the stick, rather than a compliance-focused approach, something that, you know, as we often think of, something that has teeth. Now, I have to say that this has been you know, one of those learning points that we have to continually come back to, and I speak particularly about myself. When you're in a position, you're the dean of a grad school, or you have a similar position like my colleague in the compliance office, who was, you know, formative of this whole program. We deal with a lot of the challenging cases, and so it's easy to kind of slip back into a mindset where you're thinking about the stick approach. But one of the things we always tried to do is pull ourselves back and focus on how we can build the culture with a positive perspective. and really do it by celebrating the good things that are happening, of which there are also very, very many, although those often aren't the ones that are crossing our desks all the time. Next slide, please. It was also a question of striking balances, and specifically, one of the areas was trying to balance the grassroots momentum that was, already in place to some extent in individual research groups and labs, and how they were going about doing this on their own, or sometimes in particular faculties or schools, and finding the balance between a way of supporting that momentum that's coming from the bottom up, while also making sure that it's aligning with the broader institutional objectives, and then more sort of that's kind of the vertical axis, and then on a more horizontal axis, really recognizing that these research teams have a lot of different kinds of people in them. A lot of the time they have faculty, they have administrators, they have postdocs, they have staff, they have grad students, all of whom have different relationships with the university. Some are unionized, some are not. They have different incentive structures and so on. So how do we balance all of those and create an environment which is healthy for all of them? And do we celebrate the team, or do we celebrate the individual? And sort of, so we, on that front, we decided to focus on supervisors or PIs who help set the tone and model good practices, but also empower trainees to take action in areas where that they can't control. And then find ways to cultivate the grassroots and align those with the broader institutional aspirations for a program like this. Next slide, please. Of course, another big area is disciplinary differences. The impetus for the program had focused on basic science labs. But of course, group research takes place in a lot of different contexts. I'm an anthropologist, we do field work. There are field schools, archaeologists going out in groups to other countries for digs and so on. And humanities department, humanities research, you think about digital humanities increasingly working in groups, and some of them identifying as labs, but the labs look very different from a typical basic science lab. And so wanting to kind of figure out where to draw the line around that, where to establish any boundaries, try to make the program inclusive, but also while keeping it focused on our key areas. And a big challenge here was language, finding the right language to describe what we're doing in ways that were meaningful to these various communities. Next slide, please. And so, one of the biggest challenges we've had is just around how to describe these groups. And it's hard to get a lot of consensus on this. And we started off with healthy labs, and grew it to healthy labs and research teams. Groups was sometimes in the mix, and now we're framing it more in terms of healthy research culture, but with a labs, teams, groups. Next slide, please. It's a challenging process, and there's been a lot of learning in terms of how the kinds of feedback that we've had. So a lot of it was expected. I think all of us have a general sense of the landscape in which we operate. And so you know what kinds of concerns people will raise. Some of them were more surprising and opportunities to learn more. Again, as we've encountered those challenges, we've made sure to kind of remind ourselves that what we're trying to do here is influence and lead rather than force compliance. And so it's all about, as we encounter some resistance in some area to how we're framing things, we pivot a little bit and hear what people are saying and find ways to incorporate their views so that they will want to participate going forward. And so because of all of this, it really is, in our view, really important to spend the time laying the groundwork, not to feel rushed, and also to get buy-in from the senior leadership. And so one of the things we did in our early stages was to really get senior leadership from all of our different faculties, schools, and so on to buy into the program, as well, of course, as the central senior leadership as well. But just get people used to the idea and understanding of what the program's about. Next slide. So now I'm going to hand it over to Lynn, who will give you more of an overview of what the program actually looks like in terms of its elements and how it's organized and that sort of thing.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I will talk a bit about how we are structuring this program, and I'll start by outlining this framework, the organizing framework that underlies the program components that I'll talk about in a minute. So what we've arrived at is 7 facets of healthy research cultures, or 7 themes around which we're organizing our activities. And these draw on published literature where available, but they were also workshopped quite extensively through that consultation process that Joshua spoke about earlier. And so they are grounded in our institutional research ecosystem, if you like. And what we've also done for each of these facets or themes is identified some promising practices. So things that we think are good places for people to start if they're thinking about how they could do things differently in their own research team or their own environment. And we're using those to guide our priorities in terms of topics for educational material or the kinds of proposals that we think we'd like to fund through our seed funding, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And so this is what we've landed on here. So we've got equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI, group collaboration, which we really think this is about emphasizing a collaborative environment, not just the kind of really competitive environment that people often feel they're working in. Leadership, so research leadership, professional development in the sense of making sure that we're meeting the professional development needs of students, postdocs, and research staff. Research integrity, supervision and mentorship, and well-being. And so these are the 7 facets that we're thinking about whenever we are developing program content. What we've put on this slide, and I think they're going to circulate or post these slides for you afterwards, we've got a few links here. So we've got some of those internal reports that we've been referencing, which have really guided us in setting priorities for our program and thinking about what we want to emphasize in those facets, as well as some selected external resources. So this is not exhaustive, but these links will give you some ideas of the kinds of things we're drawing on as we think about what are good practices. Are there established frameworks or best practices for some of these areas of work? Are there things other people have successfully implemented that we can draw on? And you'll notice that a number of these are from outside of Canada, as well as some, Canada-specific resources. So again, this isn't everything, but this will give you an idea of some of the things that we've drawn on as we've tried to think about the content of the program. So the program components that we'll talk about today are the education program, which is really about identifying, explaining, and promoting healthy research practices. Awards that we're using to celebrate people's contributions to creating or sustaining a healthy research culture, and seed funding, which we're hoping to use to support and scale local initiatives. And when I say local, I'm in that, early on, Joshua spoke about the structure of our institution. It is big. We are in multiple locations, and we have different academic units that have quite a lot of autonomy. So things can be developed within a given department or other unit and have trouble getting out to the rest of the institution. So in terms of the education that we're developing, as I think you saw earlier in our list of folks who'd contributed in earlier stages of this program, there is quite a lot on offer already at the University of Toronto. And so we really wanted to develop things that were complementary to those existing offerings, those existing initiatives. And so we've chosen to be very practical. We're working on interactive workshops that have a lot of opportunity for peer learning, which is something in particular that our faculty really value, is the opportunity to learn from faculty peers who've had success implementing a particular good practice in their own research lab or team. And the other thing that we really wanted to make sure was that, we're asking people to invest their time in doing this. And so we wanted it to be not only informative, but really useful, so that at the end of a session, people would be walking away with some kind of output that they could take and think about implementing in their own research group right away if they were interested in doing that. So we really wanted to make it worth people's time in taking time out of their highly pressured schedules to engage with this kind of material. And those workshops are organized around those 7 facets. So the topics are organized into those different themes that I talked about earlier. The other thing we're doing is some awards. And this has been kind of an interesting thing to develop. We really wanted the focus to be about surfacing or platforming good practices, and making sure that we're not only celebrating excellence in research output, so what comes at the end of a research project, but also making sure that we are celebrating excellence in how the work gets done. So the process of doing the research itself actually matters, and we want to put that on equal footing with some of the other kinds of professional accomplishments that are more routinely celebrated at our institution. And so we've really put the focus here on celebrating an activity or an initiative that has had some kind of impact on research culture, and providing that award to everybody who worked on that initiative. So it's not about an individual being very accomplished in this area of work, but it's really about the work itself. And then lastly, our seed funding. So we wanted to have a way that we could identify promising initiatives, because we have really smart people doing very creative, innovative things already, and we know that that is happening across the institution. And we also have people who would really like to do something, but there's not always an obvious source of funding for it. And so this is our way of being able to support people to develop and deliver some of those grassroots initiatives, perhaps on a small scale initially, or to take something that has been really successful in a given academic department or faculty or division, and helping that make that available to the wider institution, or helping it to scale, giving it a platform from where we sit centrally, having an overview of all of the graduate students and supervisors at the University of Toronto. One other thing we wanted to touch on, and I think this has come through throughout the presentation, is that an initiative like this, changing culture like this, is only really going to be effective if there's a community built around it. So this trying to impose some kind of new structure centrally without that momentum would be really challenging in an institution that's got the collegial governance that ours does. So we do have a working group that's active and providing input on the program components and the content, as well as the plans for implementation and communication strategy and things like that. And the other thing we're thinking about in terms of community building is really about the celebration aspect. So having an annual summit or symposium event that will allow us to bring people together who are interested in this area of work, who are already engaged in projects, who really feel like this is a priority, bring those folks together to have some time to focus on healthy research practices, on how we should be running our research environments, to celebrate achievements that people have had or successful projects, and connect people who could be doing similar kinds of work in a big institution and not really realize that they could benefit from working together. And not only does this build momentum, but we think it's also one of the ways that we can get some more capacity. So as we think about growing this program in the future, and Joshua spoke about the timescale we're talking about in the long term, and that kind of culture change, in order to have capacity to do that, we really need a lot of buy-in, and we need more of a community pushing this initiative forward. And so that's our thinking around bringing people together in this really hopefully fun and informative and exciting annual event that we're planning. So I think at this stage, I'm passing it back to Joshua to kind of summarize for you.
Great, thank you, Lynn. And just sort of building a little bit on that last point around the community. So, you know, one of the things that's always been kind of in my mind about this is that across our highly decentralized institution, there are a lot of faculty who are actually investing significant time in this kind of work already. You know, all it takes is conversations with people, but also, you know, I've spent some time just looking around lab websites, you know, many of which kind of sit off of our university servers and so on. But you can really see how a lab is expressing its identity, and also kind of how they're expressing their own culture in those sites, because they're important sites for, you know, researchers to recruit. And you really see that some PIs are putting a good deal of attention into this. And so part of this work is also about recognizing labor that's already happening, that may not always be getting the kind of recognition it deserves in the normal merit processes that we have, you know, which, as we know, very often tend to focus on publication and objectives like that. And so building up that culture of recognition also allows the people who are doing existing work in this area to kind of advance through other pathways. And as I said before, similar to how we recognize teaching. So just to kind of sum up then, the focus here has been on on enhancing research training experience at U of T by focusing on research culture and team environments, as opposed to, say, program or departmental or supervisory relationships specifically, although there's obviously overlap with all of those. This is being done in a context of quite a large institution, and then very importantly, we have a very devolved structure and a lot of diversity across our very decentralized institution. And that provides us with a good deal of complexity in rolling something out centrally that all our stakeholders can kind of recognize and endorse. But it also provides us with opportunity, because you find pockets where people have been doing amazing things on this front that we can learn from, and that we can then invite them to share with colleagues in other corners of the institution. Overall, we're adopting a celebratory approach, which aims to provide as much sensitivity as possible to the variation in programs that we have, the variation in disciplines, and the kind of research methods that are being used. We very much expect this to be a long-term process. It's not going to be quick, and we want it to be as inclusive as possible and to gradually build up momentum over time. And I think key to that for us is really shaping and supporting a community of interested people who care about this anyway, and have not yet had a kind of forum and a context in which they can share their ideas and bounce ideas off of others and learn from one another. So with that, I think we'll wrap up the core part of the program, and maybe we'll have some time for some discussion and questions.
Thank you very much to both of you, Joshua and Lynn. I know that you've already been answering some questions in the Q&A panel, Joshua, and I encourage you to take a look and see if your question has been asked already and answered. But there have been several questions coming in since then, and two of them have to do with funding. One person asked, how did you get funding for your seed fund? And is it something you hope to get long-term funding for? I think it's related to the other question about monetary resources, perhaps your own, coming out of your own budget committed to this project.
That's right. Thank you. That's a really key question, obviously, for all of us and many who are in these times facing tight budgets and so on. So, we have at the outset of this, we collaborated with the Office of the Vice President, Research and Innovation, and we kind of contribute to get the ball rolling and to get things moving forward. We just kind of committed in-kind resources like staff member time and that sort of thing, so that we could build up enough to then take to our annual process, where, for instance, the School of Graduate Studies can bring forward a request to the provost and get a budgetary allocation into our base budget if we are successful. And so we used that in-kind kind of contribution to build up the sufficient momentum and to use that time to bring in all the leadership and then identify these areas where we could insert ourselves into problem solving that was already taking place. So, I was participating in that presidential and provostial task force on student mental health, and we saw issues coming up in that context, which were very much things that a Healthy Labs initiative could help contribute to responding to. And so, I encouraged, our leadership to include mentioning the Healthy Labs, Healthy Research Teams program in the administrative response to that report. Now that then provides us with some rationale and ammunition when we go forward to the leadership with a budgetary request. And so, we got essentially enough from the provost to hire a staff member, as well as some additional funds that will at least be part of the costs associated with the seed fund. And then I have a Dean's Initiative Fund, and I'm going to be drawing on that for the first few years. And then we'll see, once we've established a track record over those pilot years, then I'll go back and potentially ask for more.
Great. Thank you. We had someone from Clemson, James, drop a link to another sort of schema or framework for graduate training that has some overlap with the 7 dimensions of your program. And it made me wonder about a question I had earlier, which is how adaptable do you think this framework would be to the humanities? Your framework was focused on team science, team research. Humanists are not famous for doing a lot of team research, although it is sometimes done. It looks like Clemson's is a little bit broader to all fields. What have you thought about adapting this to the humanities, or do you think there's potential there?
Maybe I'll let Lynn take that, because she actually ran a focus group with some humanities scholars.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I don't come from a humanities background, so it's been a learning experience to understand that context. But one of the pieces of feedback I thought was interesting from them was that there is, particularly in departments where there are folks doing more team-based work and folks who are doing more maybe traditional kind of individual or dyadic work, that actually they really liked the idea of more collaborative working, and that they were interested in looking at this and how they could create some of those structures and some of that community and some of the positive aspects of working in larger groups for their researchers and their trainees who don't already have that. But I think, I mean, a lot of it is like, yes, there are special dynamics that emerge when you have particularly large lab groups where you might have a PI and multiple postdocs and lots of graduate students and specialized research staff. But a lot of the core concepts and principles, you know, are applicable to anybody, particularly when we think about working culture, what it's like to come to work, what it's like to be in that environment. What is the supervision like? Are your professional development needs met? It's a little bit, you know, you have to change how you think about things a little bit. So for example, equity, diversity, and inclusion, talking about diversity in the team or interpersonal dynamics in a diverse group doesn't apply as much if you're working on your own. But I think a lot of the other aspects do really apply. And I would say that the level of interest, it hasn't been less interesting to folks who are working in humanities. But what is really important there is that that's where the language really starts to matter, because talking about healthy labs, labs and teams, some people found like, oh, that must not apply to me then. So that's why we've kind of started to talk a little bit more about research culture, meaning the environment in which researchers are working, which really does apply to everybody. So yeah, it's a great question though.
Great. Thank you very much. We have another question from Alejandro de las Peñas. How do we start moving people from their comfort zone and not alienate them? People in general do not like change. Certainly you're taking a more positive approach, which, you know, I imagine makes people less threatened by some of the work you're doing. But you know, you're also creating a kind of arguably some peer pressure there, as you're holding up some examples of people doing a really good job. So do you want to answer that question?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's exactly it. It is about building peer pressure, and also tapping into our existing culture of achievement and reward. And you know, one of the reasons problems can arise in these group environments, and especially these larger settings that Lynn was pointing to, is the output focused incentives that exist in research funding and other metrics that researchers are striving to meet. And that goes not just for faculty, but also for students. It's often the race that people are on to try to achieve and get all their, you know, necessary achievements in place for their various promotions and so on, that takes the focus away from some of the more healthy practices. And so this is also about creating a parallel incentive structure that people can plug into and see others achieving within. And I think in that regard, it's a good approach. And at a recent meeting, I bumped into our current ombudsperson, who happens to be a former senior faculty member from our faculty of kinesiology and physical education. And over his time, he did a lot of research on coaching, and all those kinds of relationships and the challenges associated with those. We know about all these national cases and so on, where those environments can be quite unhealthy. And he really sees in this program the kind of delicate approach that's needed of how to shift a culture through incentive structures and celebration.
I think I'll just add to that a little bit. I saw another question that Joshua answered in the chat about the sort of taking the carrot approach, but how do you deal with bad actors? And I think it's very important to be clear that this program, you still need to have those structures in place for when there is misconduct or abuse or harassment. Like, this program is not going to address that kind of behavior. But that, having those, the compliance office and those other policies and procedures already in place allows us to focus on meeting people where they are, and trying to make it not intimidating. And again, trying to think about coming from the place that most people are probably trying to do a good job and, trying to do the right thing. But we know, for example, people probably manage and mentor in the way that they experienced management and mentorship or supervision as a trainee, which is probably, not uniformly a good example to draw on. And so letting people know that there are other ways to do things and providing them the resources to try something different, and the permission to experiment in that way, I think is really powerful. And it's something that has really resonated with folks. Like, when we bring this to faculty members who you might think would kind of press back a little bit about, whether it sounds like more work or whether it's not the way they want to do things, they're actually quite excited about it, because they've been trying to do a good job the whole time. So coming from that strengths-based approach, I think is more powerful than you might think.
Thanks again to you both. I think we're ready to move on to our wrap up. And I'll pass it on to Joshua to talk a little bit about his session at the annual meeting.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julia. So we just wanted to, highlight the fact that we'll be at the annual meeting this year, and it's going to be an opportunity for more discussion. So really excited to see, the example in the chat about another institution's approach, and to kind of compare notes. And our idea here is really, well, on the one hand, we're going to dive down a little deeper. We'll show you some of the more practical documents that we've created and associated with this program, and dive a little deeper into how we see the different facets or themes that have been identified, and the kinds of concrete examples of those things that we've collected through our consultations. And then partly as an opportunity to have more of an interinstitutional discussion about this, learn from one another, and also contemplate the question of whether this might be an area that a group of institutions might want to get together and create a set of principles around, or a set of best practices, or something that could potentially be of benefit to all CGS members. And so, if you have an interest in this area, if you've been developing your own program, we would really, really be grateful if you would attend, and hopefully we can just make it as conversational as possible.
Thank you again, and a quick reminder that when you register for the annual meeting, if you're interested in participating in that session, it is a pre-meeting workshop. So remember to sign up for that in addition to the annual meeting. And Sarah has put a link to registration for the annual meeting into the chat. So thank you, everybody. I hope each of you has taken something from this presentation that you can use, and we will see you soon in December in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Len. Thank you, Joshua.